The smell of oxidized silk is something you never forget once you learn to recognize it. It has a sharp, almost metallic tang, like copper pennies left out in the rain, mixed with the faint, dusty exhalation of an old library. I sat at my drafting table in the converted textile mill overlooking the harbor, staring at the shattered remains of a 1928 Delphos-style gown. The fabric had literally splintered, the once supple pleats now looking like dry, cracked river mud. I didn't cry as I ran a gloved finger over the ruined hem. I just felt the heavy, quiet settling of a trap, springing shut exactly as I had designed it. To understand how a nearly century-old museum-quality garment ended up destroyed in my studio, you have to understand the architecture of my desperation. 3 years ago, my husband Mark died after a brutal, drawn-out battle with a neurological disease. He left behind a gaping hole in my chest, a stack of medical debts that felt mathematically impossible to overcome. And this dress. The gown had belonged to his great-grandmother. It was the only piece of tangible history we had kept when the medical bills forced us to sell everything else of value. During those 3 years, I survived by throwing myself into my work as a historical textile conservator. But passion doesn't pay off hospital liens. For that, I needed capital, which meant I needed my stepsister, Eden. We had co-founded Row Archival Garments a decade earlier. I possessed the technical mastery to restore decaying fabrics, and Eden possessed a ruthless, magnetic talent for marketing them to high-end vintage collectors and bridal boutiques. When Mark got sick, I had stepped back from the business. Eden kept the lights on. She secured the clients, handled the logistics, and effectively kept me from drowning. I was grateful. But gratitude is a dangerous currency, and Eden charged a steep interest rate. She slowly converted her sweat equity into legal leverage, acquiring a 49% stake in the business. By the time Mark was gone, Eden wasn't just my partner. She was my warden. Whenever I tried to secure a buyout or take out a loan against the business to finally clear Mark's lingering debts, she blocked it. She liked the arrangement. She liked being the face of the company, parading my meticulous restorations on her social media, while I remained the silent, grieving widow in the back room. The tension between us was a quiet, humming wire, but it didn't snap until she announced her engagement to a local real estate developer. Eden decided her engagement party wouldn't just be a celebration. It would be a brand launch for our new bridal offshoot. For weeks, she scoured our inventory, rejecting every piece I offered her. She wanted something exclusive, something with a story. I should have known she would find her way to the climate-controlled cedar locker in the back of the studio. I kept Mark's family gown there, sealed in unbuffered acid-free tissue. I had spent over 800 hours meticulously stabilizing the fragile silk, using a highly specific proprietary chemical compound to relink the deteriorating fibers. It was a labor of grief, a way of keeping my hands busy so my mind wouldn't wander to the empty side of my bed. I wasn't in the studio the afternoon she took it. I only found out when I arrived at the botanical gardens for the party. The humid air of the greenhouse was suffocating, thick with the scent of orchids and expensive champagne. And there was Eden, standing beneath a canopy of ferns wearing my late husband's heirloom. The blood drained from my face so fast I had to lean against a stone planter to stay upright. The silk caught the string lights, shimmering like liquid silver. She had altered the neckline, aggressively pinning the fragile fabric to accommodate her modern jewelry. Tristan, the freelance photographer we frequently hired to document our inventory, found me hiding near the catering tent. He handed me a glass of water, his eyes tracking my gaze toward Eden. He knew exactly what she was wearing. He had spent 2 days photographing the macro details of the pleats for my private archive. "Tell me you permitted this, Sloane," Tristan muttered, his voice tight with professional horror. "Tell me you didn't just let her walk out with a museum piece." "I didn't know," I whispered, the glass trembling against my teeth. "She's going to tear the side seams. She's moving too fast. Sloane, go up there, take it off her, it's your property." But I didn't. I stayed rooted to the spot, paralyzed by a sickening calculus. If I caused a scene, if I humiliated Eden in front of her wealthy fiancé and his influential family, she would never agree to release her shares. She would tie me up in litigation for years, and the medical creditors would foreclose on my house. I was trapped in a cage made of numbers and contracts. Then came the toast. Eden tapped her crystal flute, silencing the room. She spoke about love, about new beginnings, and then she gestured smoothly to the dress. She looked right at me, a sharp, challenging smile playing on her lips. She announced to the crowd of investors, family, and friends that this magnificent piece was a symbol of our bond. She boldly claimed it was a celebratory offering from the business, a gesture of my blessing for her new life. People turned to look at me, raising their glasses. The expectation was heavy, physically pressing down on my shoulders. I looked at the dress, at the fabric that held the ghost of my husband's family, and then I looked at Eden's eyes. They were completely devoid of guilt. She believed her own narrative. She believed that because she had carried the business, she was entitled to its contents and, by extension, my life. I raised my glass. I smiled. I stayed entirely quiet. Tristan looked at me with undisguised disgust and walked out of the greenhouse. I didn't blame him. I looked like a coward. But as I watched Eden twirl, placing immense stress on the century-old threads, a cold, crystalline clarity settled over me. Eden only knew the surface of the business. She knew the prices, the clients, and the aesthetic. She knew absolutely nothing about the chemistry of restoration. She didn't know that the stabilizing compound I had used on that specific gown was highly reactive. It required a specialized ozone chamber cleaning. If exposed to perchloroethylene, the standard solvent used by even the most high-end luxury dry cleaners, the compound would rapidly crystallize, causing the silk fibers to shatter like spun glass. Eden was obsessed with presentation. I knew, with absolute certainty, that she wouldn't bring the dress back to me to clean. She would want it professionally pressed and boxed by her favored luxury cleaner across town before making her grand return to the studio, presenting it to me as a finished chapter. I just had to wait. 4 days later, the storm broke. Eden burst into the mill, carrying a large garment bag. Her face was flushed, her usual polished veneer completely fractured. She threw the bag onto my drafting table and unzipped it with shaking hands. "Look what they did," she shrieked, her voice echoing off the brick walls. "Those idiots! Look at it!" I stepped forward and looked down. The dress was ruined. The fabric had split along every major stress point, the fibers curled and brittle. It looked as though it had been baked in an oven. I kept my face perfectly neutral, masking the profound ache of losing the physical garment beneath the necessity of my plan. "What happened, Eden?" I asked, my voice flat. "I took it to Sterling Cleaners." She paced frantically, running her hands through her hair. "They said they knew how to handle vintage. I was going to bring it back to you pristine. Sloane, you have to fix this. You have to weave it back together or whatever it is you do." "It's chemically compromised," I said, putting on a pair of cotton gloves and gently lifting a shattered sleeve. "The structural integrity is gone. It can't be fixed." For a moment, I saw a flicker of genuine panic in her eyes, a rare acknowledgement of consequence. But Eden's survival instinct was entirely predatory. The panic vanished, replaced by cold calculation. "Fine," she snapped, waving a hand dismissively. "It's a loss. We'll file a claim." I paused, lowering the sleeve. "A claim?" "With the business insurance," she explained, already pulling out her phone. "It's inventory. It was damaged in transit, effectively, while being used for a brand promotion. We have that blanket policy for high-value garments. What was the appraised value on this? It's a 1920s original, right? It has to be worth at least 50,000. "Eden," I said slowly, "you can't claim this on the business insurance." "Why not?" She looked up, eyes narrowed. "I need capital for the wedding, Sloane. The developer's family expects a certain standard. This could actually work out perfectly. We get the payout. I get my wedding funding. And maybe I'll even let you buy out a percentage of my shares with whatever is left over. It's a win-win." She wasn't just stealing my history. She was trying to monetize its destruction to fund her vanity, leaving the business with skyrocketing premiums and me with nothing. "I have to compile the paperwork," I said quietly, turning my back to her so she couldn't see my face. "Do it fast," she commanded, walking toward the heavy metal door. "I want this filed by tomorrow." Over the next 3 weeks, I meticulously built the snare. I didn't just compile the insurance claim. I gathered the original provenance documents, the deed of transfer from Mark's grandmother, and my own chemical restoration logs. I contacted Tristan, who, after hearing my explanation, provided the time-stamped ultra-high-resolution macro photographs of the dress prior to the party. The insurance company predictably flagged the claim. A $50,000 payout on a single destroyed garment required an independent appraisal and a formal mediation meeting. The meeting was set in a sterile, glass-walled conference room in an office park near the highway. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly, casting harsh shadows on the grey carpet. I arrived early and sat on one side of the heavy oak table. Eden arrived 10 minutes late, flanked by a man in a sharp navy suit. This was Mr. Hayes, the attorney she had retained using company funds. She looked radiant, exuding the casual confidence of someone who had never faced a consequence she couldn't charm or bully her way out of. Across from us sat Vincent, the insurance investigator and mediator. He was a quiet, meticulous man with wire-rimmed glasses and a posture that suggested he spent his life looking for the catch. "Thank you both for coming," Vincent said, arranging a stack of manila folders perfectly parallel to the edge of the table. "We are here to discuss claim number 884 Bravo, the total loss of a 1928 Delphos-style gown filed under Rowe Archival Garments commercial property policy." "It's a straightforward tragedy, really," Eden's lawyer Hayes began smoothly. "My client utilized a piece of company inventory for a highly successful promotional event. A third-party vendor subsequently destroyed the asset. We are seeking the full insured value." Vincent nodded slowly, tapping his pen against a legal pad. "Yes, I have the claim documents here, submitted by Ms. Eden Rowe. However, during our routine verification process, a few anomalies presented themselves." Eden crossed her legs, looking mildly annoyed. "What anomalies?" "The cleaners admitted they processed it. They just claim they aren't liable for vintage degradation." "The anomalies don't concern the cleaners," Vincent said mildly. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick, heavy, tamper-proof envelope. It had the seal of an independent textile forensics laboratory on the flap. My heart hammered against my ribs, a steady, rhythmic thud, but I kept my hands perfectly still on the table. "Mr. Hayes," Vincent continued, looking directly at the lawyer, "did your client inform you of the specific chemical composition used to restore this garment?" Hayes frowned, glancing at Eden. "I'm not sure how the proprietary restoration techniques of the business are relevant to the loss, so long as the item was inventory." "That is exactly the point," Vincent said. He broke the seal on the final envelope and slid a multi-page document across the table toward Hayes. "This is a forensic analysis of the ruined fabric. The silk was treated with a highly specialized polymer cross-linker. It is a brilliant piece of conservation chemistry. It is also entirely undocumented in the inventory logs of Rowe Archival Garments." Eden shifted in her chair, her confident smile faltering slightly. "My sister handles the back room. Sometimes her logs are messy. That doesn't invalidate the claim." "It does when the dress doesn't belong to the company," Vincent stated, his voice dropping a register. He pulled another sheet from his folder and placed it next to the lab report. "This is the deed of ownership. The garment belonged to Margaret Yardley, who bequeathed it to Mark Yardley, who left it to his widow, Sloane Yardley. It was never transferred to the business. It was never listed on any commercial inventory sheet. It was private personal property stored on the premises." Hayes stared at the documents, his professional mask slipping. He turned to Eden, his voice low and tight. "Did you take a private asset and file a commercial claim on it?" Eden's face flushed an angry red. She slammed her hand on the table. "That's ridiculous. Sloane and I are partners. Everything in that studio is shared. I wore it for the business. I announced it as a family gift to the business at my engagement party. She was standing right there. She didn't say a word." "Silence is not a legal transfer of ownership, Ms. Rowe," Vincent said dryly. "She let me take it," Eden yelled, pointing a manicured finger at me. "She knew I was taking it to the cleaners. She set me up." I finally spoke, my voice calm and echoing loudly in the sterile room. "I didn't let you do anything, Eden. You took it from a private locker while I wasn't there. You altered it without permission. And I didn't warn you about the dry cleaners, because by the time you brought it back to me, the damage was already done. You didn't ask me how to clean it. You just handled it. You vindictive... Eden lunged forward, but Hayes grabbed her arm, pulling her back into her seat. Quiet, Hayes hissed at his client. He was looking at the paperwork, doing the legal math in his head. Mr. Hayes, Vincent said, folding his hands, your client removed private property from the premises, destroyed it through negligence, and then attempted to file a commercial insurance claim for $50,000. In my industry, we refer to that as insurance fraud. The penalty for which, under state law, includes significant fines and potential criminal prosecution. The silence in the room was absolute. The hum of the fluorescent lights suddenly seemed deafening, all the color drained from Eden's face. The reality of the sterile room, the documents, and the mediator had finally pierced her bubble of entitlement. Hayes took a deep breath, smoothing his tie. He was a pragmatist. He saw a sinking ship and instantly calculated how to keep his own feet dry. Mr. Vincent, I assure you, if there has been a misrepresentation of ownership, it was a misunderstanding between partners. We will, of course, withdraw the claim immediately. Withdrawing the claim doesn't erase the fact that it was filed, Counselor, Vincent replied, nor does it address the destruction of Ms. Yardley's personal property. I looked at Hayes. I don't want to press criminal charges for the theft or the fraud. Eden's head snapped toward me, relief washing over her face before quickly morphing back into a sneer. See? I told you. She's just being dramatic. She knows she owes me. However, I continued, speaking over her and keeping my eyes locked on her lawyer, I will only waive my right to involve the authorities if we resolve the issue of the business equity today. My partner's actions have demonstrated a gross breach of fiduciary duty and a fundamental risk to my company's commercial standing. I want her 49% stake surrendered immediately, in lieu of damages for the destroyed heirloom, and to prevent a fraud investigation. You're out of your mind, Eden screamed, standing up so fast her chair tipped backward and crashed to the floor. I built that business. You just sit in the dark with old rags. You are not taking my company. It's not your company, Eden, I said softly. It never was. You just held it hostage. Hayes didn't look at Eden. He looked at me, then at Vincent, and then at the forensic report that proved his client had lied to him. Lied to the insurance company and stolen from a widow. Sit down, Eden, Hayes ordered, his voice devoid of any previous warmth. No, she's trying to extort me. She is offering you a way to stay out of a federal courtroom for wire and insurance fraud, Hayes snapped, his patience entirely evaporated. If she presses this, the engagement party will be the last high society event you attend for a decade. Sit down. Eden slowly sank back into her chair, her chest heaving. She looked at me, and for the first time in our lives, she saw me not as a stepping stone, not as a silent, compliant resource, but as a wall she had just crashed into at full speed. The negotiations took less than an hour. Hayes drafted a preliminary surrender of equity right there on his legal pad, advising Eden to sign it before I changed my mind. She signed with a violently shaking hand, tearing the paper slightly with the pen. She didn't say a single word to me as she threw the pen down and stormed out of the glass conference room. A month later, the weather turned, bringing the crisp, biting wind of late autumn off the harbor. I stood in my studio in the old textile mill. The space felt entirely different now. Lighter, quieter. The crushing weight of the medical debt was finally manageable now that I had full control of the business finances and could secure a proper commercial loan. Tristan was setting up his lighting umbrellas in the corner, preparing to shoot a new acquisition. A stunning 1930s velvet opera coat. On my drafting table, under a protective acrylic case, lay a section of the shattered 1928 Delphos gown. I hadn't thrown it away. I had taken the largest surviving piece of the ruined silk and carefully mounted it on archival board. The fibers were fractured, the chemical bonds permanently severed, but the way it caught the afternoon light was still beautiful in a strange, fractured way. It was no longer a dress to be worn. It was a map of what I had survived. It was the price of my autonomy. I ran my hand over the smooth acrylic, feeling the solid, undeniable reality of the barrier between the past and the present. I picked up my tools, turned on the magnification lamp and went back to work. The acrylic case on my drafting table was supposed to be the end of it. I had my company back, the medical debts were finally being consolidated, and Eden was gone. That's what I told myself as I watched the autumn frost creep up the massive windows of the mill. But sociopaths don't just walk away when they lose a round, especially not when there is an audience watching. Eden's engagement to Julian Vance, the real estate developer, was the centerpiece of her existence. Losing her 49% stake in Row Archival Garments didn't just damage her bank account, it threatened the curated identity she was selling to the Vance family. She had positioned herself as a self-made female founder, the creative genius behind a booming luxury brand. Without the business, she was just a woman marrying into money. I should have known she wouldn't let the narrative rest. 3 weeks after the mediation, where she signed away her shares, I received a certified letter from a prominent downtown law firm. Not Mr. Hayes, the pragmatist who had advised her to surrender, but a shark named Sterling who specialized in aggressive corporate litigation. The letter was a formal notice of a pending lawsuit against me for fraudulent coercion and breach of oral contract. Eden was claiming that I had fabricated the forensic chemical report to extort her shares under duress. It was absurd. The mediator, Vincent, had seen the independent lab results. But the lawsuit wasn't designed to win in court. It was designed to bleed me dry in legal fees before I could secure the commercial loan I desperately needed to save the studio. The Vance family had deep pockets, and Julian was clearly funding Eden's revenge. The next morning, Tristan walked into the studio holding a tablet. He didn't say a word, just set it down on my work table next to a 1910 lace bodice I was rethreading. It was a social media post from Eden, a highly produced, tearful video. She was sitting in what looked like the Vance family library. In the video, she claimed that after years of supporting her grieving, mentally unstable sister, me, I had turned on her. She told her followers that she had accidentally damaged an old dress I was storing, and in a fit of misplaced grief over my late husband, I had locked her out of the business she built, stealing her life's work just weeks before her wedding. The comments were a bloodbath. Hundreds of people, including our high-end vintage clients, were calling for a boycott of my studio. "She's burning it all down," Tristan said quietly, leaning against the brick wall. 3 of our pending bridal commissions just emailed to cancel their contracts. They said they don't want to support a toxic business. I stared at Eden's crying face on the screen. She was weaponizing my grief. She was using Mark's death as proof of my instability. The cold, analytical part of my brain, the part that could spend 12 hours matching the tension of a single silk thread, took over. "Let them cancel," I said, my voice steady. They were Eden's clients anyway. They buy into the drama. We don't need them. "Sloan, we need the cash flow. The commercial loan hasn't cleared yet. If the business accounts dip below the threshold, the bank will pull the offer. We'll lose the lease on the mill." "Then we need to find out where the rest of the money went," I replied, standing up and pulling off my cotton gloves. For years, I had let Eden handle the bookkeeping. I was the silent partner in the back room. But during the mediation, when Vincent was reviewing the commercial property policy, I had noticed a discrepancy in the insured inventory list. I had been too focused on the trap I set for the dress to look closer. Now I had a reason to dig. I spent the next 3 days locked in my office, going through 7 years of digital ledgers, tax filings, and bank statements. Eden had always been careful to give me the executive summaries, keeping the granular data locked behind passwords I never bothered to ask for. But when she signed over the company, she forfeited her right to those accounts. It didn't take long to find the rot. Eden hadn't just been using the business to fund her lifestyle. She had been systematically skimming from our highest-paying clients. She would quote a client $10,000 for a museum-quality restoration, invoice them for that amount through a third-party payment processor she had set up, and then route only $7,000 into the Row Archival operating account. She recorded the remaining $3,000 as a materials sourcing discount. She had been doing it for years. The total was staggering. Over $150,000 siphoned off to fund her designer clothes, her luxury vacations, and most recently her lavish engagement party at the Botanical Gardens. I printed the ledgers. The paper felt heavy in my hands, weighted with a betrayal that went far beyond a ruined dress. She had let me drown in Mark's medical debt while she was stealing the money that could have saved my house, money that could have paid for his experimental treatments. The anger I felt wasn't hot or explosive. It was absolute zero. It froze the last remaining drops of familial obligation in my veins. I needed a lawyer, not just a defensive lawyer to swat away her frivolous lawsuit, but someone who could dismantle her entirely. I found one through the State Textile Historical Society, a woman named Beatrice, who had successfully prosecuted high-profile art forgery rings. She was expensive, but I offered her a contingency based on the stolen funds. Beatrice sat across from me in her austere office, reviewing the ledgers with a predatory stillness. "This is embezzlement, plain and simple," Beatrice said, adjusting her tortoiseshell glasses. "But it's better than that. The third-party payment processor she used, it's registered to a Shell LLC in Delaware. And guess who she listed as the co-director of that LLC?" I felt a cold prickle of dread. "Me?" "No," Beatrice smiled, a thin, dangerous line. "Julian Vance." I blinked, struggling to process the information. Her fiancé? Why would she put him on a shell company for stolen funds? She probably did it recently, to legitimize the asset history when they were drafting their prenuptial agreement. The Vance family would demand thorough financial disclosures. Eden needed to explain where her sudden influx of personal wealth came from, so she tied the shell company to him, likely claiming it was a joint investment venture they were starting. "Julian is a real estate developer," I murmured, the pieces snapping together. "He's heavily regulated. If he's tied to an LLC that's processing embezzled funds, his lending licenses get frozen," Beatrice finished, leaning back in her leather chair. "His family's entire development portfolio gets flagged for a federal audit. She didn't just steal from you, Sloan. She accidentally infected her billionaire fiancé with a felony." The trap I had built for the dress was small, intimate. The trap Eden had built for herself was a sprawling, catastrophic labyrinth. "What's our next move?" I asked, the air in the room suddenly feeling very thin. "We don't file the countersuit yet," Beatrice advised. "Eden's wedding is in exactly 2 weeks, correct? The society event of the season." "Yes, 500 guests at the Vance estate." "Good. We let her keep pushing her narrative. We let her spend the Vance money on this frivolous lawsuit. We let her feel completely in control. Meanwhile, I'm going to draft a comprehensive forensic audit report and prepare a civil RICO claim, naming both Eden Rowe and Julian Vance as co-conspirators in corporate fraud. Over the next 2 weeks, the pressure campaign against my studio intensified. Eden's social media followers began leaving 1-star reviews on every platform. A local lifestyle magazine published a piece painting Eden as the victim of a jealous, unhinged sister. Tristan and I worked in silence, surrounded by the physical artifacts of history, while our modern reputation was being shredded. I received daily emails from Sterling, Eden's attack dog lawyer, demanding I surrender the company back to her and issue a public apology or face utter financial ruin in court. I didn't reply to a single one. 3 days before the wedding, Eden made a fatal mistake. She was so emboldened by my silence, so convinced she had broken my spirit, that she showed up at the mill. She didn't come alone. She brought a small camera crew, a local documentary filmmaker she had hired to chronicle her resilience and the lead-up to her wedding. I was in the middle of cleaning a fragile Victorian mourning veil when the heavy iron door of the studio swung open. "Keep rolling," Eden whispered loudly to the cameraman as she marched in, wearing a pristine white cashmere coat. Tristan immediately stepped in front of the camera, holding up his hand. "Turn that off. You don't have clearance to film here." "This is my sister's studio," Eden said, playing perfectly to the lens, her voice thick with manufactured empathy. "I just want to talk to her. I want to make peace before my wedding." She bypassed Tristan and walked right up to my work table. I didn't look up. I kept my eyes on the delicate black lace, my tweezers moving with microscopic precision. "Sloan, please look at me," she pleaded, her voice trembling just enough to sound authentic. "I know you're hurting. I know Mark's death broke you. But you don't have to do this. You don't have to steal my life just because yours didn't work out." I carefully set down my tweezers, I pulled off my magnifying glasses and looked up at her. The camera was hovering just over her shoulder, a red light blinking steadily in the dim studio. "Are you wearing a microphone, Eden?" I asked calmly. She looked momentarily thrown by the question, but quickly recovered. "I just want transparency, Sloan. I want people to know the truth about what happened to my company." "Okay," I said. "Let's talk about the truth." I opened the top drawer of my drafting table and pulled out a thick, bound folder. It was the preliminary audit Beatrice had prepared. I didn't hand it to Eden. I just set it on the table. "I'm glad you brought a camera," I said, my voice echoing off the high brick walls, "because I have a message for Julian Vance." Eden's empathetic mask slipped, a flash of genuine confusion crossing her eyes. "Leave Julian out of this." "I can't," I replied, "because you made him a co-director of Apex Consulting LLC in Delaware." The silence that fell over the studio was instantaneous and absolute. The only sound was the whir of the studio's climate control system. The color drained from Eden's face, leaving her skin a pale, sickly gray against her white cashmere. "Turn the camera off," Eden snapped, her voice suddenly harsh and guttural. The cameraman, sensing the shift in tension, lowered the rig slightly but didn't stop recording. "I said turn it off," she shrieked, lunging backward and slapping the lens. "You wanted transparency," I reminded her, not moving from my stool. "Apex Consulting LLC is the shell company you used to divert $150,000 in client payments from Rowe Archival Garments over the last 4 years. It's a very simple embezzlement scheme, Eden, but attaching a federally licensed commercial real estate developer to your money laundering vehicle, that was incredibly stupid." "You're lying," she whispered, looking wildly at the camera, then at Tristan, then at the door. "You fabricated those." "The bank records are subpoena ready," I said softly. "My attorney is filing a civil RICO suit tomorrow morning, naming both you and Julian. I imagine the State Banking Commission will freeze his development assets by Friday. Just in time for your rehearsal dinner." Eden stared at me, her chest heaving. The curated, victimized bride was gone. The predator beneath was trapped in a snare she couldn't charm her way out of. She realized, in that split second, that I wasn't fighting for the studio anymore. I was going for the foundation of her entire future. "You wouldn't," she breathed, terror finally piercing her arrogance. "The Vance family will destroy you." "They won't care about me," I corrected her. "They are going to care about the woman who dragged their name into a federal financial crimes investigation. How long do you think Julian will stand by you when his family's billion-dollar portfolio gets audited because of your vanity?" She didn't have an answer. She stumbled backward, bumping into a mannequin, and practically ran for the heavy iron door, leaving the bewildered cameraman standing alone in the center of the room. "I think we're done here," Tristan told the cameraman gently, pointing toward the exit. When the studio was finally quiet again, I looked down at the Victorian mourning veil. The delicate black threads were strong, resilient, holding together long after the person who wore them was gone. I put my magnifying glasses back on, picked up my tweezers and went back to work. The wedding was in 3 days, and the real storm hadn't even begun to break. The morning after Eden fled the studio, the legal machinery we had carefully assembled snapped into motion. Beatrice filed the civil RICO claim at exactly 9 in the morning. By noon, the State Banking Commission received our formal notice regarding Apex Consulting LLC. We didn't have to wait until the rehearsal dinner for the explosion. It happened at 2 o'clock that afternoon. Julian Vance didn't just send his lawyers, he came with them. They bypassed me entirely and went straight to Beatrice's downtown office. I was summoned an hour later. When I walked into the wood-paneled conference room, Julian looked nothing like the polished, untouchable heir from the engagement party. He looked like a man who had just discovered he was standing on a live landmine. His lead counsel was reviewing the printed ledgers with grim fascination. Julian didn't look at me with anger. He looked at me with clinical, terrified urgency. He needed to know exactly how deep the infection went. Beatrice walked them through the digital paper trail, showing precisely how Eden had routed the stolen client funds through the shell company bearing his name. Julian's hands visibly shook as he read his own forged signature on the incorporation documents. Eden hadn't just lied to him, she had forged his consent to make him the shield for a felony. The Vance family had built their empire on immaculate credit and municipal trust. Eden had jeopardized billions in development contracts for $150,000 of stolen vanity funds. The wedding was cancelled before I even made it back to the mill. There was no dramatic announcement, no tearful scene at an altar, no public shouting match. The Vance family operated with the brutal, silent efficiency of a corporation. They simply dispatched a brief mass email to the 500 guests citing unforeseen legal complications, dismantled the massive catering tents at their estate, and completely severed contact with Eden. Her frantic phone calls to Julian were blocked. The Vance lawyers immediately filed their own injunctions against her, burying her under an avalanche of corporate litigation to aggressively distance their client from the embezzlement scheme. Eden lost everything in a matter of hours. The high society future she had meticulously lied and stolen for was vaporized. Without the Vance family's protection or their money to fund her frivolous lawsuits, she was entirely exposed. She faced the fraud charges from my business, the pending investigation from the insurance company regarding the ruined dress, and a sudden, intense audit from the IRS regarding her undeclared income. She tried to reach out to me exactly once, leaving a rambling voicemail that swung wildly between screaming threats and desperate sobbing apologies. I didn't delete it, but I didn't return the call either. I simply forwarded the recording to Beatrice to add to the file and permanently blocked the number. 6 months passed. The bitter winter thawed into a bright, crisp spring. The commercial loan cleared without a hitch, allowing me to fully consolidate Mark's remaining medical debts and secure a long-term lease on the studio space. The scandal had initially caused a dip in our clientele, but the departure of Eden's drama-hungry socialites actually made room for a different tier of business. We began attracting serious museum curators and historical societies who valued discretion and technical mastery over social media clout. Tristan stayed on as my full-time archival director, bringing a quiet, steady, and drama-free rhythm to the workspace. I stood by the massive windows overlooking the harbor, letting the afternoon sun warm my face. The studio smelled of cedar wood and clean ozone, the heavy, suffocating tension of the past years completely gone. On my work table, a 1912 silk velvet traveling suit waited for structural reinforcement. I walked over and gently brushed my bare fingers against the sturdy, well-woven fabric. I glanced at the corner of my drafting table, where the shattered fragment of Mark's family gown still rested beneath its protective acrylic case. It didn't make me sad anymore. It was just a boundary line. I slipped on my cotton gloves, adjusted the magnification lamp, and began the slow, deliberate work of piecing history back together, finally free to build my own.
Editor. The infographic presents Sloane's story as more than a conflict over a destroyed antique dress. At its center is a struggle involving grief, family manipulation, financial dependence, social image, professional ethics, and the gradual recovery of personal autonomy. The shattered 1928 gown represents both the memory of Sloane's late husband and the emotional boundaries that Eden repeatedly ignored. Because the garment was private property rather than company inventory, Eden's decision to take it, alter it, wear it publicly, and send it to a conventional dry cleaner was not simply careless. It was an act of entitlement that treated Sloane's history as a resource available for Eden's personal ambitions. The timeline shows how the conflict grows through a series of increasingly serious violations. Eden first takes the heirloom without permission, then publicly describes it as a family gift, forcing Sloane into silence in front of influential guests. After the dress is chemically destroyed, Eden attempts to transform the loss into an insurance payout. This moment reveals an important pattern in her behavior. She does not experience consequences as a reason for reflection. Instead, she immediately searches for another opportunity to gain money, status, or control. Psychologically, Sloane's silence is initially shaped by complicated grief and financial fear. She is mourning her husband, struggling with medical debt, and dependent on a business partnership that Eden has gradually converted into a form of captivity. Her restraint may appear passive, but the infographic explains that it is a survival response. Sloane understands that an emotional confrontation could cost her the company, her home, and the remaining stability in her life. Her transformation begins when she stops trying to persuade Eden and starts relying on evidence, expertise, and patience. Eden's behavior reflects extreme entitlement, image management, and a lack of empathy. She believes that her public role as the visible face of the company gives her ownership over everything connected to it. She creates narratives in which she is always the founder, the victim, the generous sister, or the successful bride. When the facts threaten that identity, she attacks Sloane's credibility and uses grief against her, portraying her as emotionally unstable. This demonstrates how social media and status culture can reward appearances while concealing exploitation. The legal and ethical sections emphasize the protective power of documentation. Ownership deeds, restoration records, photographs, bank statements, and forensic analysis turn Sloane's private pain into verifiable proof. The distinction between personal property and company inventory becomes essential because silence does not transfer ownership, and a business partner cannot insure or monetize an asset that does not belong to the company. Eden's false claim exposes her to fraud consequences, while the later audit reveals that the damaged gown was only one part of a much larger pattern of financial abuse. The discovery of embezzlement changes the story from a family dispute into a case of systematic exploitation. Eden had allowed Sloane to struggle with debt while secretly diverting company revenue to finance luxury, social prestige, and her engagement. By linking the shell company to Julian, she also places her future marriage and the Vance family's financial reputation at risk. Her downfall does not occur because Sloane becomes crueler than her. It occurs because Eden's own deceptions become too interconnected to survive examination. The final sections focus on resilience rather than revenge. Sloane regains control of the company, restructures her debts, attracts serious institutional clients, and rebuilds her professional identity around technical excellence. The fragment of the shattered gown remains under acrylic as a memorial and a boundary between the past and the present. It can no longer be worn, but it now represents what Sloane survived. The infographic ultimately shows a movement from shock to silence, from silence to evidence, and from evidence to autonomy. The ruined heirloom becomes a lesson about grief, coercion, invisible labor, accountability, and the quiet strength required to reclaim control of one's own life.